Hey everyone, welcome to Logan Smosh Pig. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Listen up, because it's time for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 20 of the Tom Petty biography. Chapter 20 is called Stan, You're Fired. Here we go. Steve Ferrone was a tap dancer from age 3. He's among a handful of notable drummers who did tap before they got behind a kit, including Earl Palmer, who at 6 years old was the tap dancing mascot to a New Orleans. The two of them dressed in matching formal wear. In Palmer's case, he'd get off the streets and into the recording studio soon enough, making records with Little Richard at New Orleans J&M Studios, Sinatra at Capitol in Hollywood. Buddy Rich tap dancer, and Steve Gadd still is. Tap is a school for syncopation that's also a school of song. There's a dynamic that's used in tap dancing, explains Steve Ferrone, that's the same as what you use when you're playing the drums. You build into the chorus. You have the introduction, the verse, all of that. I tap danced to Georgia, slow, and I won a car doing it. The sentimental education of Steve Ferrone distinguishes him from his Gainesville bandmates. Different teachers, different schools, but the same lessons. In a way that never could have happened in the American South, British-born Ferrone didn't even recognize himself as black until it was pointed out to him. It just never came up when I was a boy, he explains. I mean, I was born 5 years after the end of the war, and people were still talking about that more than anything else. His mother, who Ferrone describes as an English rose, blonde hair, very, very fair, was from a different world than that of his father, who, when Ferrone first met him at age 9, was the darkest man he had ever seen in his life. His father had been in England, on a cultural exchange with a dance troupe from Sierra Leone. Ferrone was an only child, born out of wedlock, when such a thing was rare, and not at all easy to negotiate, even without mixed-race parents. Ferrone got his Italian name from the midwife who helped bring him into the world. I looked sort of olive-colored when I came out, he explains, so they said, "We're safe, he looks Italian." And this midwife had been to see Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat when there was a guy at the back of the boat whose name no one could remember. They'd say, Mr. Ferrone. The midwife wanted to call me Tony Ferrone, and my mother went along with that. Somewhere along the line, a little tampering added an E to his birth certificate, and Ferrone became Ferrone. In an act of maternal solidarity, the mother took the son's name. She became the father in the household, going to work each day, while Ferrone's grandmother assumed the maternal role, cooking and caring for the boy, even heading down the block to confront the man who called Ferrone If the young Steve Ferrone wasn't thoroughly confused by that time, he was probably going to be okay. By the time Ferrone met Mike Campbell, the two musicians among those borrowed from Eric Clapton's band, for a George Harrison performance at Royal Albert Hall, Ferrone had played in early Stones-era blues bands, studied jazz and learned to read music, joined the Average White Band as a full member, and found a mentor in Arif Mardin, with several stops in between. He was a well-respected session player and a first-call live drummer. Campbell liked the way Ferrone played, and mentioned the drummer's name to Petty. It was a year or so later when Ferrone received a call from a booker in Los Angeles, wondering if he'd be interested in doing a top-secret session. The money was right, and Ferrone was okay with not knowing who he'd be working for. I walked into Sound City, he says, and it was Mike and Tom sitting there. It was more than a background in tap dancing that made Ferrone the right guy for Petty's second solo project. What Petty had been looking to find was, in some ways, what Ferrone had been training to be. While working with French drummer Christian Vander and his stepfather Maurice Vander, Ferrone was told to throw away his metronome, to instead practice with James Brown and Ray Charles records playing in the background as he worked with written music. A metronome offered perfect time. Those records offered time and feel. Much later, when he got busy as a session musician, Ferrone learned that drummers who wanted to work needed to make peace with the machine. It was the 80s. I was moaning to Jeff Porcaro, Ferrone says, about having to play with a click track. Jeff sort of sat there, listened to me, and then said, "Well, you can play with a click track, right? You don't have a problem doing that?" I said, "No, it's easy. If you got time, it's the easiest thing in the world." Jeff looked at me and said, "Take the money." It worked. It changed my attitude completely. During sessions with producer Russ Titleman, Ferrone recorded drum tracks playing each part of his kit separately. One track had the hi-hat, another the kick, another the snare, and so forth. Each part of the kit played independently of the others. It was an approach a riff Martin had arrived at and Titleman had picked up on, allowing maximum control over the sound of the drums. It was not unlike what Jeff Lynne had done on Full Moon Fever and Into the Great Wide Open. Ferrone's job would be to make it sound like a drummer was sitting at a kit playing it all at once, and he could do it. At Sound City, with introductions and pleasantries behind them, Petty and Campbell plugged in and got to experience what it would be like if the Heartbreakers had a drummer with Ferrone's kind of control and feel. In Tom Petty and Rick Rubin's recollections, they auditioned 5 drummers, maybe more, but started Ferrone on the song Hard on Me. He shows up, sets up his drums, says Campbell, and we count the song off as a practice, and it was the take. We were like, wow, this guy's time is amazing. How about you wreck me? We played it once, and it was done. Okay, let's talk business. The only problem for Steve, explains Campbell, was that he was coming from a more active type of playing, and he really had to break it down to essentials. No drum fills. We wanted the songs to speak without any business in the drums. He had to get used to that. You can hear what they were after by listening to You Don't Know How It Feels. When Tom was in front of Stan, says Bugs Weidel, there was always this thing in his mind of, are we speeding up? Are we slowing down? Are things in control? Should we rein it in? That was always kind of in the back of his mind. With Ferrone, it's like there's a rhythm machine back there. None of that is even an issue. For the first time in Tom's life, it was like, drummer? There's a drummer? When Ferrone was asked to do something, he responded like a session man and did it. To this day, it's never been any of my business what happened with Stan. They made great records with him. I know that, says Ferrone. For Petty, though, it was impossible to see Ferrone except as a point of contrast to Stan Lynch. And he liked the difference. With Ferrone in the studio, the Wildflower sessions began. They'd go on for a few years. It almost seemed that if Petty had his way, the sessions would still be going today. At the same time that Steve Ferrone walked into Sound City, Stan Lynch was already out in the world, sharing his views, voicing his discontent a few decibels louder than he had in the past. Wildflowers was another album he claimed not to understand from the outset. He went out of his way to say he didn't like the songs. Everyone loves to hear about the top man. Petty picked up the chatter secondhand, got mad about it behind closed doors, and carried on. He felt betrayed when Lynch played the underdog. As a layer on top of that, what happened between Campbell and Lynch on the Dylan tour had started something that was begging for some kind of culmination. Everyone was surprised at how long Campbell refused to speak to Lynch. No one in the band or on the crew wanted that to be accepted as the way things would be. During the making of Wildflowers, the studio was Petty's bomb shelter in the backyard, and he didn't want Stan Lynch or Jane Petty near it. That it took 2 years to cut the album is as much a testament to Petty's belief in what he and Rick Rubin were chasing as it was a sign that he was using the studio as an alibi, the place he could hide out to avoid confronting the troubles around him. There was definitely tension in his life, says Rick Rubin. I would say that of all the records we worked on together, and we worked on a good amount of stuff, he was the most engaged and put the most time into Wildflowers. And I would also say that it seemed he didn't really want to leave the studio. Like, he didn't want to do anything else in his life. I think he wanted to take his mind off whatever was going on at home. By Rubin's estimate, they had 30 songs ready to go before they even started recording tracks. Petty seemed to be putting all of his honesty into the songs, not in how he lived, but in what he wrote and sang about. The music was getting all of him. That's the Divorce album, says Petty. It just came before I left. Where the Jeff Lynne recordings had the shimmer of pop music built for the radio, Wildflowers is the most intimate song cycle Petty had yet created, with tracks that felt largely unadorned. No matter the complexity of what went into them as productions, Time to Move On, Hard on Me, Only a Broken Heart, To Find a Friend, Don't Fade on Me, they were all snapshots in a dark family album. When the Pettys gathered at their beach house in Florida to listen to the finished record, as they always did, Adria Petty says she knew the marriage was over. She heard it in every track on Wildflowers. He was leaving. But before that would happen, band members came to a head and bought the family some time, for better or worse. In the middle of making Wildflowers, we had to record a few things for the Greatest Hits album, says Rick Rubin, and Tom was adamant that he didn't want to take anything from what we were doing with Wildflowers for that album. He wanted to go into a different studio with Stan and do the Heartbreakers separately. I think one of them was Mary Jane's Last Dance, then Something in the Air. But we did some others for the box set. Stan Lynch came in from Florida. They worked quickly, cutting live as the band so often had, with Rubin acting as producer, and Petty working up an old, unfinished song that needed a chorus, a song that would become, that afternoon, Mary Jane's Last Dance. I was told by Rick Rubin that the drums should sound like Give Me Shelter, says Stan Lynch, and he only wanted to hear one fill. First off, I'm going, who the are you anyway? You seem like a cool guy. You seem to be successful, and that's great. But I don't really give a about you. You're a hired man. There's 5 guys here for that matter, and you ain't one of them. You. So I'm discounting every piece of input, being that total wad that I have to be to sign my work. It would be Lynch's last recording session with the band. By all accounts, he certainly wasn't endearing himself to the producer. I felt somewhat like I had spiked the ball, says Lynch. They gave me a song cold, as they always did, and expected me to come up with something cool. And I did. Take 2. Still, the producer and his pleb are in there muttering about Give Me Shelter or something. I just put the sticks down. There's no vibe. Nobody high-fives me. Nobody went, "Hey! Hey!" It felt more like, get him the out of here. So I did that for them. I walked out. And that was that. I flew home. It's another moment of tension between the various accounts of what happened. George Drakoulias remembers cutting many more tracks than Mary Jane's Last Dance, as does Mike Campbell. On the subject of high fives, there's a general consensus that any such gesture would have been curiously out of place in a Heartbreakers session. They didn't deny themselves the satisfaction that accompanied a good take, but at the same time, they never responded like a sports team, and certainly never named an MVP. They were a band. Petty saw Lynch again when his family went to St. Augustine after the Wildflowers recording was completed. It was Petty's last effort to cut through the tension, with the practical matter of planning a tour on his mind. I went over to see him, recalls Petty, and said, "You know, let's put our difficulties behind us and do this tour." It was a huge tour we were going to go out on, but all he'd say was, "Really?" I'd say, "Yeah, I'm going to need you. If you want to do it, the offer's there." "Really?" he asked again. "Yes." And I just never got a confirmation that he'd do it. Not then, not later. About a month before Wildflowers was coming out, the Heartbreakers were scheduled to play the Bridge School benefit, and I saw him again at that. Neil Young's Bridge School benefits had been a regular thing for the Heartbreakers. Lynch flew in from Florida to make the Bay Area show. It was 2 nights, and the first night was one of the only times I remember just being embarrassed by a performance, says Petty. We were so bad, just bad. And it was bad because of Stan. He just couldn't, or wouldn't, play the... His heart wasn't in it. His mind was not in it. Then, after a big argument in the van after the show, we had to do it again. And the next night, I was sitting in the dressing room with the window open next to me, and I hear Stan talking to one of the guys in Crazy Horse. I don't think he remembers this. He was doing his usual bull, like, "What are you guys up to? What are you doing?" And whoever it was said, "Oh, you know, we're doing this thing with Neil. Then I've got a little time off." Then he asked Stan what he's up to, and Stan goes, "Well, this ain't my main gig. I've got some other stuff going on." Like, I was incensed. Like, this ain't your main gig. Later I found out he's been doing auditions that past year. That was it for me. Bugs Wydell remembers the Bridge School concerts as another turning point for the band and crew. During the course of the weekend, Wydell recalls, Stan systematically pissed off most of the band, most of the crew, the people in the office. We came back that Monday and everybody was going, "That's it." I think he knew that was the only way it was going to end. Like, he couldn't quit, and he knew that Petty wasn't going to fire him. So I think it was just like, let's force the issue. Lynch doesn't necessarily challenge that idea. "Yeah," he said, "maybe." Regarding what Petty overheard, Lynch says, "I probably did say that. I imagine that was my direct response to, what do you do when Tom does all these solo records? What do you do when he takes 2 years off the road?" I must have said something like, "Well, I have other things to do. I mean, you didn't call me for 2 years, and you make records without me? Why the... wouldn't I find something else to do?" At his tree farm outside of Gainesville today, just back from sessions in Nashville, Lynch looks as much the farmer as anything. He hasn't previously talked publicly about the Heartbreakers to any great extent, but he's finally opening up. The conversation goes some 8 hours over 2 days. "We're coming into the final chapter here," he says, suggesting that it's time to talk and time to move on a few steps more. And we all went through something together. After discussing the Heartbreakers at length, moving between a recognition of just how good it was and anger at how it went sour, he's asked what he could have done differently over the course of his time as a Heartbreaker, and he takes the question seriously. The 20 years since that Bridge School show have given him time to think it over. But not surprisingly, the subject is difficult. He moves between anger and regret, wearing himself out after hours of going in between the two. If he's moved on, it's not complete, and it probably won't ever be complete. It certainly isn't for Petty. When nobody wanted me to do my thing, Lynch says, that's when I went. When my thing, whatever it was, wasn't their thing, it went on me. But I could have been calm. I didn't need to be emotionally. I was shooting flies with a shotgun. I didn't need to be so big, so loud, so noisy. I see that guy in the room now, and I don't like him. If I could talk to that guy, if I was the father of that guy, I would have gone, son, you're a fool. You just don't know it yet. So why don't you keep your mouth shut and let a few things work around you? He regrets how it ended, but he doesn't have an entirely realistic version of how it might have been different. I would change the exit, he says. The last act was so bad. Give me a chance to acknowledge that I'm leaving. I was told by a therapist years ago that I like ceremony. I needed some of that. I had to burn things. I literally burned a drum set fire to it. I burned pictures. I tore some up and threw them in the ocean so the tide would take them out. Because I needed the ceremony of like, this is gone now. I needed closure. I don't like the ending, but I love the book. He suggests that one last tour might have been that closure, but also understands that perhaps such a thing would not have been possible, that there was just too much garbage in the soil to do any planting. As far as the music goes, Lynch facilitates between feeling he didn't get what he deserved as a player, particularly in the studio, and that something had to change, and he was it. The musical component wore itself out, he says. Tom wanted to go somewhere that I was incapable of going. It wasn't even a question of whether I wanted to. But if Tom had just said, Stan, it ain't you, it's the plan, that would have been the kindest thing. The last part of what Lynch says, however, doesn't ring true. The only thing harder than telling a band member of 20 years that he's not cutting it musically would be hearing it from a band leader. There's no sign in Lynch's characters that suggests such criticisms would have sat well. Not then, and not now. He's human in that way, but possibly more to the point. He was hearing about his drumming more than he wanted to, since early on, and he never liked it. I think I probably should have faced up to it much earlier on than I did, says Petty, and I'm not talking about just the drumming. I didn't agree with the way Stan felt about a lot of things, with his take on life. I knew that behind my back, he was trying to undo me, and that meant undoing the band. I kept this romantic notion in my head that everything would be okay, that everything would right itself. But it didn't right itself. It got worse and worse and worse. I think I should have maybe seen that very early on and done something about it, but I didn't. And when I did, it was really ugly. He'd invested 20 years of his life, but I was young and learning along the way. Petty went to the other Heartbreakers before the final call was made. I asked everybody in the band, told them that I was thinking about firing Stan, Petty says. I went, what do you think? And to a man they said, it's gotta happen. Ben Montench was in Nashville, writing. I remember getting the phone call from Tom, Tench says. Stanley had been really unhappy because we had been making a record without him. And I can understand why. If everybody's on the record but you? Into the Great Wide Open was made with Stan on the whole record, and I played a few piano flourishes. I know how uncomfortable it is. I didn't like having an unhappy Stan in the band. But more so, I realized that Tom couldn't work with Stan anymore. He couldn't do it. And I didn't want to see the band end. I thought if he tried to work with Stan anymore, it's just going to blow up. We're going to destroy a good thing. It broke my heart into a million pieces. But I told Tom, you gotta do what you gotta do. Bugs Whitell speaks of a deceit that colored Lynch's dealings with the band particularly with regard to Petty. Stan had a devious side. It evolved over the years, he says. He could create elaborate stories. I mean, I love him and wouldn't be here without him. But he could engineer situations. That was going on all the time with him. So in the end, the bigger question is, how did Petty put up with that all these years? And the answer is because Tom wanted the band. Talk about someone who's going to make a commitment and follow it through. For sake, it would have been easier for him to go, okay, you're out of here. Who am I hiring next? Tony Demetrius made the call after that. The first thing out of Stan's mouth, Demetrius says, was, "Am I fired?" And I said, "You are, Stan." Stan would do these impressions, assistant road manager Mark Carpenter says of Lynch, with Richard Fernandez at his side, smiling in agreement. He can impersonate anybody. David Lee Roth, Dylan, he could do Tom. Stan was one of the funniest guys I've ever been around, to the point where you're screaming at him, "Stop! Stop!" He'd keep going until you couldn't breathe. He could have been a Vegas performer, says Petty. He did it so well. He would find these little mannerisms and phrases just nail a person's character. He could kill us. We did have a lot of good times together. It was an extraordinary thing we went through. I try to look at it from that side of things. But I can't make myself believe he was really completely on our team. I could never fully believe what Stan was telling me. I know on stage he was on my side. He wanted that to work. When we made the live anthology, which to me is the most accurate document of what we were and are, the real warts and all picture without studio glorification, I was very impressed with his drumming and how great his singing was. I wanted to write him a note and say, I hope you realize how great some of this music was that we made together. I hope you'll listen to it and remember it that way. But I don't think we've had 2 conversations since the last one we had. And since he left, it's funny, but there haven't been a lot of arguments in the band. Little ones, sure. But the political side of things vanished. The problems we faced from there on out were generally artistic, not personal. A complicated band became downright simple to operate. So that's that. Lynch shows his bitterness, his anger, his love, even gratitude, sometimes all in one look out the window. But he also captures some truths about Petty that only an outsider and an old friend can access. Those still on the payroll won't always say everything they're thinking. And Lynch always had that gift, that curse. The first time I really checked Petty out, Lynch says, was also the first time I ever took magic mushrooms. I went to this arcade in Gainesville with a friend who had taken them just before me. There were flashing lights, and it's all going crazy. I'm high out of my mind, and I knew who Tom Petty was from Mudcrutch. Knew him, but didn't know him. But Tom's there playing this game at the arcade, and every time a game ends, he puts his hand behind him over his shoulder, staring straight ahead the whole time, and whoever was with him puts a quarter in his hand. He never looks away, totally focused. In my mind, this went on for an hour. His hand keeps going back. Takes the quarter, plays another game. Then my friend on mushrooms goes into a seizure. He didn't tell me he was epileptic, but he's having this massive seizure brought on by the flashing lights. He's on the floor crying. There are people trying to keep him from swallowing his tongue. I mean, it looks like he's dying. You see what's happening here? I took the mushrooms just after him, and I don't know he's epileptic. I'm thinking I'm next. It was a nightmare. The paramedics came, and then I began to understand from them that he's an epileptic. So I'm taking a deep breath. I'm going to be okay. But Tom, I realize, has been playing this game the whole time. The arcade's going crazy behind him, and someone's having a seizure, but his hand just kept going back each time he needs a quarter. Stares straight ahead. Never looks back. That's Tom Petty. I could see into him, Lynch goes on. I knew who he was, even when we started out together in the band. I could see that he was scared. I could see that he wanted to be important. I knew what he wanted. He wanted you to hear him. He wanted to be that boy. But I also knew this is a frightened guy. And we're getting into big things. This is big surf. Part of my job was to reassure him. Like, we're going to come out of this fine. These gigs are ours. We're playing big places. But you know, we got this. Mother. He was ambitious and scared, making... Sure, you think he's not either one. Tom's cool. That's what he loved. That's what he became. He made that face for so long, it became permanent. But early in life, he had to invent himself. Well, that's the end of Chapter 20. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 20 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.